Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very pleased to have with us this evening David Stewart to talk about his latest book, The New Land. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. Post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of The New Land. So David, as readers of his numerous previous works have come to know, loves history. Sometimes he writes about it as it was, other times he employs it as a basis for fiction. But either way, he's made good use of it since choosing some years ago to leave a legal career as a trial and appellate attorney and become an author of history and historical fiction. Along the way, too, he served for much of the previous decade as president of the Washington Independent Review of Books. He's now also on the board of the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland. With The New Land, David launches a fictional trilogy, the Overstreet Saga, inspired by the experiences of his mother's family from their immigration to the Maine coast in the 1750s. This initial volume follows the challenges of a German family that lands in Maine and contends with a tough climate, disease, war with Indians and Frenchmen, and of course, the war for independence from Britain. Later volumes will take the saga well into the 20th century. In conversation with David will be Maria Arana, Peruvian-American author of nonfiction and fiction, who in her several books has sought to explore and explain both the Northern and Latin American cultures. Once a senior publishing executive, Marie also worked in journalism for a time, editing the Washington Post book review section. For a number of years, she served at the Library of Congress as a key organizer of the annual National Book Festival. So David and Marie, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Brad. Wonderful to be here. Let me just start by saying how much I appreciate Politics and Prose, one of the great literary institutions in the Washington, D.C. area. And I want to thank especially Brad and Lisa for your sort of valiant service to book lovers during the pandemic. You have hung in there and you've made the world a better place for readers. Thank you so much. Now, it's such a pleasure to be here to introduce and interview an old friend. I've known David for about 15 years now, which is about the length of time David has pursued a vigorous, successful career as an author. So, hello, friend.
Hey, Marie, thank you so much for doing this. I'm very pleased you could join me, and I certainly join your remarks about Politics and Prose. It's the center of the writing world here in DC.
Right. It's great to see you on my screen, and congratulations on the publication of this brand new novel, The New Land. It's quite a story, wonderful story. And so Brad has introduced you. He said a couple of words about you, especially about your career as a lawyer. And just want to mention a few things more. You graduated from Yale Law School. You became a clerk to the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Lewis F. Powell. You practiced law in the District of Columbia. You focused on white-collar crime. All of that sort of very serious legal career. And then your fortunes turned when you sat down about 15 years ago, which is when I met you, to write your first nonfiction book, the summer of 1787. And we had lunch a few times to talk about the book business in general and about the book review business in particular. And you haven't stopped writing since.
I like it. I was on a panel recently with other writers, and they were asked, what's it like to write a book? And they all said, oh, it's agony. It's so hard. And my reaction was, geez, you guys should be digging ditches. This is really a pretty good gig.
Yeah, it is. Well, and you've done the whole gamut, right? Because you've done nonfiction, you did history, you did Andrew Johnson, Aaron Burr, James Madison, George Washington, an incredible book on George Washington. And then you sort of padded it with your fiction, which you began in, I think it was like 2013, around there, David.
That was the first novel, yeah.
Yeah.
The first one to get published.
Yeah. And so you started with these three historical sort of chiller novels, and now you've turned to something completely different, a totally new road. So we're going to talk about that in this program. So let me start by asking you about that career shift from lawyering to writing. You're not the first guy to do it. We can name quite a few people who began in law and went on to become writers. I mean, there is Washington Irving, there's Harper Lee, Franz Kafka, not to mention, of course, John Grisham, Scott Turow, Bernard Schlink. For all the lawyers who are out there listening to you right now and who dream of making a jump to writing books, tell us a little about how that happened for you.
For me, it was not, I wouldn't have described it as a terrifically free choice. I really was done practicing law, and I needed to find something else to do. And I really just sort of thought to myself, I would love to write a book. And my wife's a very nice person, and she said, okay. When lawyers ask me, how do you do that? I always tell them the first thing to do is look in the mirror and say, I want to make a lot less money. So true. They're prepared for that. And it is, one of the great pleasures for me, I was a trial lawyer, an appellate lawyer, and I had to, I was advocating for a client, and it was a great treat to just sit down and say, oh, what really happened here? What is right and what is wrong? And I wasn't, hamstrung by my professional obligations, and that was a great pleasure. So it's just been a real privilege to be able to do something else and enjoy it.
So apart from telling lawyers who are dreaming of your career that look in the mirror and see if you want to make less money, what other major thing predisposed you, coming from a legal career, to writing?
I always wrote as a lawyer. Certain types of law practice involve a lot of writing, and mine did a lot of appellate briefs and written work for even trial work. And it was something I enjoyed a lot. And coming out of law school, when I clerked for a few judges, that's what I did. And I had been a newspaper reporter as just out of college. So writing was always a comfortable thing for me.
And you were doing a monthly column, weren't you, David, on for the American Bar Association? So you were using your pen.
Yeah, and it was a bit of a calling card that I could write. So I had a certain belief in my ability to do that. And then the transition is to go from that sort of thing to something book length, which is a bigger deal. And can you sustain it? Can you understand the book format? And I actually used the Writers Center as a training ground for me. It's always humbling in your 50s to go sit around and try to learn from other people, but it's also a good kind of humbling, and they helped me a good deal.
Yeah, I always tell people that the real training ground for writers is reading. It's basically reading books, getting a feel for how a story develops, the whole business of the pace of a novel, the pace of a biography, which you've done. So you begin, David, quite logically with books that touch squarely on constitutional law, your books on Madison and Burr and Washington, and then you move on to the historical thriller and the Lincoln Deception and the Paris Deception and the Babe Ruth Deception. And now you take another turn entirely. So tell us what The New Land is about.
Well, I feel a bit like I've been writing this book for much of my life, or this trilogy. it comes out of my mother. When I was 7 years old, and I was a history mad kid. It was it wasn't great for my social engagement, but I just loved reading about things that had happened. And famous family story is always that I would read the encyclopedia, just sort of pull out the P's and see what was going on. And she did this wonderful thing one day where I asked her what a ring that she always wore was, and she told me something that turned out not to be true, but was incredibly inspiring, which was that it had been taken off the dead body of an ancestor who had died during the Civil War, and they saved the ring from the battlefield. And for a 7-year-old, what could be more romantic than the glorious death on the battlefield and protecting the country? And it stuck with me. And I sort of would circle back to her over the years for the real story. And her family had come to this country, and she fed me a certain amount of misinformation, which included that the ancestors, and her family name was Overlock, which is my middle name, came from France, Alsace-Lorraine, which is the northeast corner. And when I finally, shortly after we got married, my wife and I did a camping trip in Acadia National Park in Maine, where we established that we should never have another camping trip. And one of the ways we got out of it was to go to this town where my mother said her people had lived, Waldoboro. And I discovered it had been settled by Germans, including I was able to trace our ancestor, whose name was Johann Gottfried Überlach, which didn't sound very French.
No. No.
And I confronted my mother with it, and she said, well, no, he was French. So since then, I've just sort of had this in my head, this advance, through the years of this family and the descendants, and I have learned something, but I never learned enough to write a nonfiction book. So a couple of years ago, I decided, well, I do know enough to write novels, and like my mother, I could make stuff up. So that's where it comes from. So
the Überlach became Overlook, which is the O in your middle name. David O. Stewart is David Overlook Stewart. And so you changed that to?
I changed it to Overstreet because I wanted to allow there is a fable in my family that anybody named Overlock is related to us, which there's no reason to think that's true. And after 9 generations in this country, that's a pretty thin relationship. Mm-hmm. But I do have cousins who still carry the name, and it seemed to me that it would only be fair to allow them deniability by changing the name. So mm-hmm. I didn't stay with it, but I liked the anglicization of the name, which was something Johann Gottfried did to get along in this country, and has been a tradition. And it was very familiar to me because my father changed his name. His family were Jewish immigrants, and the family name was Schwartz. So he changed it to Stewart to confound all those anti-Semites in the world. Immigrants have been doing that for a long time.
Common American story. So how did your mother react when you said, hey, we're not French, we're German? How did she react to that? Pure denial. She did not accept it. She's came of age in World War II. She's married to a Jewish descended man, and she was not going to allow that to be true. Mm-hmm. It just is, though. So it didn't. It worked for her. So obviously, this story of the Overstreets, the Uberstrasses, very closely hews to your own life. Tell us how closely it is related to your true story.
Well, one of the things we know about Johann Gottfried was that he was, and this was an interesting phrase, a soldier of the high troops. And that means generally that as a German from the Rhineland in that era, he was a mercenary. That's what they did. They were poor. One of the reasons the Germans came to this country was they were so poor. And frankly, that's still true. That's why people come here often. And that, I think, triggered my imagination very much, because where they landed in Maine was a very violent place. The French and Indian War was just about to start. Tribes had been pushed aside by some settlers, not so much in Maine, but much more in Massachusetts, and they were not doing well with it. They were not content, and they'd been flim-flammed, which is another one of our traditions. And of course, the immigrants who came here hadn't done it to the tribes, and frankly, they got flim-flammed too. But it was, they ended up in a very dangerous place. And I was lucky to find a history of this town they landed in, Waldoboro, which described their early years in impressive detail. So I could draw on that. And, you know, there's Tolstoy wrote about the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not Tolstoy, but it's okay to put your story in history and use those powerful external events to shape people, and then to be shaped by the people you're writing about.
Well, particularly when you've been thinking about the story since you were 7 years old. I mean, and the intriguing aspect of it. I mean, the sort of overlay of truth to and the fictionalizing of the truth is what I mean to say, that your mother did. It was constantly sort of like a tease to you to find out more and to learn more.
Had she told me the real story, it wouldn't have been as interesting. And I don't know that this is absolutely true, but I think most family stories are partly true.
Embellished, would you say? Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally embellished.
And, it's part of the, how we reconcile ourselves with what we've been through and what our ancestors have been through. And it's fascinating to try to unpack that.
Right, right. So the pivot of the story is that the German who emigrates has been a soldier in the war, and there is this conviction that he will never fight again, he will never kill again, he will never do this again. Does that part of the story actually part of your family history as well? There was a refusal to be part in the war?
I don't know that.
Could have been the War of Independence, of course. Yeah.
But, if you've been a mercenary, you have fought and potentially killed, certainly risked your own life for something that basically doesn't matter to you. You're a professional soldier. You are not fighting for your homeland. You are, and these Germans were mostly fighting for the English king, about whom I suspect they cared very little. And that's got to be a hideously alienating experience.
Yeah.
And for him to do that change of direction, and maybe it spoke to me because I've had my own change of direction, to say, okay, what I've done is not what I'm going to keep doing, I think had to be terribly important to him, and led him to this very adventurous path, but also a dangerous one.
Yeah, and war is very much at the heart of the story.
Well, it turns out the wars follow him.
Yeah. Yeah. It turns out that wars follow your family in general. How exactly did you, for those who are interested in constructing a historical novel on the basis of their families or on the basis of some story that intrigues them in history, how did you actually conduct your research?
There are, tools which genealogists know well, which are the census records, the church records. If you do have a church, and in Waldoboro, there was a church that was particularly significant. And Waldoboro is a town. It's a very small place, but good God, they have documented themselves. And you can still read the minutes of town meetings from the 19th century.
Wow.
And they're just as dreary then as they are now. So those are some things you can do. And as you get closer to the modern era, you get other public records, land records. And I never had the advantage of a diary or correspondence, which would have been a great leg up. But I feel very strongly about the importance of place, at least in this instance. Going to Waldoboro, and it has not changed all that much. You do get a feel for the place, and just to chat with people, not about significant matters or sit down and interview them about their history, but just get a sense of their attitudes and experiences. And the sense of the feel for they're right on the coast. It's a beautiful spot, basically. And then to you have an ability then to imagine what it was like, which I think is essential with historical fiction.
Yeah. So and I imagine, David, that with your background, somebody who has written history and who has steeped themselves in the the founding period, that these images were readily available to you. I would think, although Maine may have stretched you a little bit.
Well, Maine was new, and it was interesting to I've been written about the great figures and their documented attitudes and positions they took. But this was an interesting opportunity to look at, and I something I knew from, again, the research I did for Waldoboro, that the folks in Waldoboro were kind of puzzled about the revolution. They looked around, and it was a lot nicer in Maine than it had been in Germany, and they were not sure why we were going to go fight and die. And the next generation, the generation that had been born in this country, was much more engaged. And I think it's the sort of dichotomy you would get in that situation. And that was a really interesting thing to explore, was the ambivalence about this issue, whether to go to war for independence from Britain, which was not uncommon. And it was all through the colonies at the time.
Right. So in the process of writing this book, you're writing suddenly about the son serves in Bunker Hill. So you're writing about sort of battlefields with which you are probably pretty familiar.
Well, I went back, and you got to look at it again.
Yeah, no doubt.
And it is a battle that's been documented like crazy through the years, and we've got a pretty good handle on what happened, which allowed me to insert him in an effective way. But what I found most interesting, I felt the need to do the battle scene, and I trust it's thrilling and exciting for readers. But I also wanted to tell the story of how much soldiers suffered off the battlefield, how the want they had, the unhygienic, to be charitable conditions they lived in, the diseases that took them away, the difficulty of recovering from wounds, and the difficulty, all soldiers have of facing battle, and then after they've faced battle, facing it again, which in many ways seems almost the more difficult thing to do.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the things that, as you looked back to researching your family history, the things that surprised you most and the things that were perhaps most challenging to write about.
Well, the most challenging is easy. It's book 3 because the figures are inspired by people I knew in my mother's generation, her brothers. And so that, that's a whole new level of dealing with. And, writers often write about their own families, but I don't. I feel like I'd rather get through Thanksgiving dinner in a happy way. So that was a real challenge. And what I struggled with, and I hope did all right with, is the notion that, these people, and I deal with them in 3 different settings, historical settings, and they're 100 years apart, basically. So they're different generations, they're different contexts, but I also want there to be identifiable or recognizable similarities between the people. Michener used to do this in his novels, and he made me crazy because they would all have the same, cleft chin or, odd mustache or whatever it was. And I just thought that was a little bit cheesy. So I didn't do that. But I did try to create some attitudes and notions that were consistent.
How faithful is it to the family story? How faithful is your trilogy? And now we're talking about the New Land specifically. How closely does it resemble your actual reality?
I knew more about the Civil War era and book 3, so they are somewhat faithful. And I will have done 6 historical novels, and I've tried to write other novels. In fact, for this, I tried to write a novel in contemporary era, which was truly awful. And I disposed of it. No one will ever see it. But I find that history gives me some guardrails. I know what's going on in the world.
Right.
And that helps me understand the progress of characters. So I have found there's lots of writers, Moby Dick was based on an actual historical incident. I mean,
correct. Right.
Authors find it useful to have what I would call guardrails, but some structure that they can then explore in their imaginations. And that was the real fun part of this.
Yeah. So how has your family, have they read it? Have they reacted to it? How has your family reacted to what you've done?
Well, my sisters have read the first 2 and purport to like them. I've been a little more cautious about book 3. And I did disclose to my cousins, and I have a fistful of cousins, there's 13 or so. I did disclose to them that it was coming out and it had a connection to the family. And I have not gotten any outrage cries and several very generous and happy notes. So it's not creating tumult yet.
That's great. That's great. I'm glad to hear it. May it ever be so. Now I want to ask you, David, about your process. How does your process differ from your nonfiction to your fiction? History is definitely the root for both. As you say, it serves as a guardrail. but the process itself is different. For those writers who are out there looking to make a leap from nonfiction to fiction or vice versa, how would you characterize your approach in those very different genre?
Well, I've done so much nonfiction that I find it incredibly liberating to work in fiction. First of all, I can make stuff up.
No footnotes.
No footnotes. Boy, you got right to the subject. It really is just a blessing, because that's several months of your life getting that stuff right. Yeah. And, I just need to get the gist. I don't really need to get the actual words. And that's all good. I love dialogue, and I enjoy writing it. And my problem with when I'm doing nonfiction is, we have transcripts of very little, so you can't really do dialogue. And if there is a nonfiction book you're reading that does dialogue, if you can't figure out where it's coming from, you should stop reading it. They're making it up.
Right.
And that's not good. So those elements are an option. A friend of mine who does both once described it's really the same process, because the question is, what happens next?
Yes, that's true.
When you're doing nonfiction, you just go find out. And when you're doing fiction, you have to sit there and cook it up. So, you're always answering the same question.
Right.
And the process is a little different.
A good story is a good story. And history is a narrative, no question about it. Could you read us a little passage of The New Land to give us a bit of the flavor and the mood of the story, David?
Sure. This is a section where it's early in the book. The wife named Christiane is on the ship and thinking about what they're doing. The ship, the journey on board is miserable, and she's lying awake feeling miserable. So when Peter came, their first son, she realized it was up to her. If she did nothing, she would watch her sons march off in the Landgraf's uniform. The Landgraf was the lead, effectively the king of Hesse, just like their father. They had no land. So she went to find the man in the market, the one who talked about America, always in a loud voice. He was short and fat, with eyes that never rested on what he saw, like a man who short-weighted grain. They called men like him who recruited for America the soul sellers. The soul seller told her that in the Maine district of Massachusetts, the soil was rich, the land empty, the seasons gentle. He had a paper folded down the middle describing a settlement owned by a General Waldo. The paper, he told her, said that General Waldo had land for settlers who would work to grow rich and fat. She thought he must be lying about some of it, maybe all of it, but she had to do something. She brought the paper home and left it on the table. She said nothing to Johann about it. He picked it up and read it, but said nothing. He placed it on the windowsill. After he left in the morning, she put it back on the table. He read it again that night. On the third night, she asked what it said. He told her that it offered land. Settlers could work for the land and pay only half fare to get to America, where the English were, a land called New England. People in their parish had gone to America, but always to Philadelphia. Johann had fought beside the English. He knew some of their language. They weren't so bad. They did what they said. Why, though, he wondered, why does this man trade land for our work and only charge half fare? Is the land bad? Is it full of these Indians and bears? She didn't answer. There must be something wrong, she knew, with the land or the offer or the ship on which they would sail. But it was their only way to get land. They had to go. Johann said he would talk to Fritz Bauer about it. Fritz knew about land. Then maybe Johann would go to the market and speak with the soul seller. She nodded. She had been in her final month with Walter, heavy and sluggish. So Johann expected no more from her. So I like that scene principally because it's something I've seen in my life, in my family growing up, and in my mature life in my own family. Women can be extremely good at changing the family's direction while not confronting anybody. And that struck me as a moment. Johann needed a shove and she gave it to him.
Clearly. David, could you get us that little taste of the book? Could you give us like a brief synopsis arc of the narrative in this particular volume, this one?
Yeah, there are a few stages they go through. First is simply surviving the voyage, then figuring out how to survive in Maine, which was not easy, just how to build shelter. They are plunged into the French and Indian War and on the Maine frontier, and they were on the frontier. That was a brutal place to be, and they live in a stockade with everybody else for years. And Johann is enlisted as a leader of their ranger company that goes to fight. And he's a soldier. He can't turn his back on his neighbors. He has to fight. And then we pick up the story. We happily can skip the dull years. He trains himself to be a carpenter and becomes a furniture maker. All new skills he acquires. And then we get to the revolution, and his son wants to go fight the British, and Johann doesn't want him to. And there's a conflict, and the son does go, and he's pretty terribly wounded. And then we careen towards a reconciliation.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to turn now to some questions that are coming in from our viewers. First of all, there's somebody who wants to salute you. Her name is Stephanie Rapetti, and she is identifying herself as related to Rapetti, who was at Curtis High School.
Yeah, Armand. Yes, he was a classmate.
She says hello. She says hello. Big high five
Thank
to
you.
you. And now here's a question for you. And it's a question that I had really, because the trilogy in general seemed perfectly imagined for the big screen. And this listener asks you, is there any chance of turning this saga into a net series? How does an author even go about trying to make something like that happen?
Well, if she knows a producer, I would love her to introduce me to them. We authors always, fantasize about this. I've had a couple nibbles, and there's currently somebody supposedly representing an earlier book of mine. But I believe something like 1 out of 1,000 actually get made. It's a long shot, and it's best not to count on it. It is such an expensive process to make these productions. And you do run into the reaction of, oh my God, it's a period piece. So we have to figure out how to film that in a place where there are no telephone wires behind it, and we don't get truck traffic, and everybody's got to have these weird costumes. So that's always a burden for someone who's written a historical piece like mine.
And seafaring and battlefields are not easy to produce.
No, it seems like they go to Eastern Europe for a lot of this now.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just a very complicated business. And they've always got their superhero movies to make. So,
What's hope, right? I mean, it's always a hope that your work will sort of transcend genre and move on to the big silver screen, which is the sort of the American addiction.
absolutely, I certainly work as much as it was required to help make that happen.
Now, here's another question for you, David. In writing historical fiction, how compelled do you feel to dig deeper into actual history? That is, when do you just stop and say, heck, I'm going to make the rest up?
You know, the toughest one, my first series, which you described as the Deception series, really did sort of play with history directly. And, you know, the John Wilkes Booth conspiracy was the focus of the first one. And I really had to know the facts of the assassination and the conspiracy and all the loony conspiracy theories that came afterwards. You know, the second one was at the Paris Peace Conference. I had to know who was there and, you know, when they were there and, you know, who were they talking to. So, you know, I don't want to get big things wrong. What the phrase I love is, you know, you can make up a lot, but Lincoln has to be tall. And for these, I did. So for those, I did do more research than I had to do for these, partly because I'd been working on these for 60 years in my own head, but also I wasn't focusing on stories people knew. You know, or, you know, somebody would say, whoa, 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 you got that wrong. So I had a greater freedom. I just needed to know the big movements. Now, obviously, when I did the battle at Bunker Hill, I made a real effort to get that right. There's another major military episode taking the fortress at Louisbourg during the French and Indian War, and that I had to get right. But for going from day to day, it's easier with fiction not to get that bogged down in things.
So you've hopped from history to historical thrillers to saga. And who were your model novelists in writing this particular saga, family saga?
Oh, that's a tough question. You know, there are historical series that I have admired. I'm not sure they're not necessarily family sagas. I've already been disrespectful towards Mr. Michener, but I do think of the Patrick O'Brian books. They're not a family, but maybe an artificial family, and he carries them through. Lord, it's over 20 books. And the notion that you put people in interesting places and interesting situations, and I was lucky that I had ancestors who were in those places, is, I think, the essence of what I was doing. I can't say, though, that there's a single example. I know that there are series that are out there that I haven't read and didn't inspire me, so I can't do much better than that.
Yeah, well, so this is the first book in a trilogy, and it's an epic story, an epic saga. And you've already, I think you said in as we were chatting before we came on this program, you said that you have already written the other 2 volumes. So it's of a piece. And it sounds like you must have written it all in one flow, and then divided them, or how did that work?
Well, I wish I could say that. I did. This sounds a little glib, but you know, I was working on this long biography, not that long, I shouldn't overstate it, but substantial biography of George Washington, which was a lot of work. And there's 70 volumes of his papers and all that stuff,
Right.
which I had to look at all of it. And so that was grim at times. And I used these stories as a break and would write them, and it was just sort of fun. So I did two of them sort of in the middle of when I was doing on the George Washington book. And then I've already alluded to, I had a third one that I became disgusted with. So then I said, well, it doesn't have to be a trilogy. It can just be two. And then I got an insight into how I could actually do a book three that was based on history, and wrote that after I had finished the Washington book. So it didn't come in one seamless fit, but you know, these stories are they're hardwired into me, and it was not hard to tap into. Of the things I've had to write, these were actually among the easier.
And you seem very, and this is a question that somebody has for you. It seems that you know, your wheels are so oiled for the revolutionary period, that my assumption would be that that period was the easiest and the most fun to write about. Am I wrong?
No, that's fair. It was a little intimidating to write about Germans. Which, you know, there was zero Germanic culture in my house, and luckily I had a friend who was German, and I could ask him to read the text and tell me. He actually told me I was spelling Johann wrong, which was very valuable. So there were things I had to pick up, but you know, the events, the sort of what people ate, how they lived, I did know a lot of that, and it was comfortable. And that was, you know, when historical figures would wander into the story, I knew their backstory and didn't have to tarry over it.
Now, speaking about the ease with the German story, Stephanie Rapetti just asks, well, you know, Alsace-Lorraine, your mother said, we're from Alsace-Lorraine, we're French, but not necessarily, right? Because Alsace-Lorraine was French and German, and there was probably a very good chance that if you are from Alsace-Lorraine, you would have some German background.
It's absolutely true. If you look at a map of Alsace-Lorraine, most of the place names are very German, but we know from the group of people he traveled with, and being a soldier of the high troops, that he was from the other side of the Rhine River.
Right. Well, so can you tell us briefly what the next two volumes will entail, David, so that we can, I mean, they're already written. The one is going to be published in the spring, right? Volume 2, yeah. And then volume 3 sometime thereafter. What can we look forward to? This story takes us next to the Civil War.
Yes, and it involves really tectonic movements in the country, which I think it was a lot of, it was a challenge, but also very satisfying to try to refract them through this family story. And this was true of our ancestor. He served in a somewhat legendary unit from Maine called the 20th Maine Regiment. And they're sometimes credited with winning the Battle of Gettysburg, which is a matter of subject to hot dispute amongst Civil War buffs. But they had a couple of heroic turns. And I could get his pension records and his military records. So I really know what happened to him. And it was very dramatic and poignant. And I was able to draw on that. And then, you know, I don't have the connections, but we know that he dragged his family out from, I mean, and it's obvious he got back to Maine after going down to the war and looked around Waldoboro and said, this town's too little for me. And there's a whole country out there. And he dragged his family out to Chicago. And that's where my mother's family lived for many years. But he was the first one to get there. And actually, my nephew, who's a historian, thinks he tracked down the actual address where he had a butcher shop. And he had to be a self-trained butcher because he was a carpenter before then. And, he got there pretty much just in time for the Chicago fire. So it's sort of a remarkable moment. But, as part of the westward push, as part of the, I think a lot of the veterans of the Civil War had that experience where they got back home and said, no, this is too little for me.
Yeah.
I've seen the world and I want to see more of it. And then the third volume is World War II. And it's just a unique situation where my mother actually was as a young woman, she was an assistant to really a secretary, but if we don't use that term anymore, but to Eleanor Roosevelt during the war.
Wow.
And her two brothers served in the Air Force, and one served in Asia and the other served in Europe. And then her father was the Midwest Regional Director of the War Production Board. I never met him. He died before I was born. But it struck me that those four characters, two on the home front, one in Asia, one in Europe, you've got a lot of the war there in their stories. And I'm not all that faithful to their actual stories because I don't know them that well. And I just wanted to, have the freedom to make stuff up.
How to write a novel, right.
But it was, as I say, an amazing structure and sort of guardrails that allowed me to use my imagination to fill in a lot of blanks.
Yeah, I bet. So Carrie Callahan wants to know, when writing a multi-generational saga, do you try to create echoes between the generations that perhaps the characters might not know, but you as the reader would know?
I try to create some echoes as I mentioned before, in their attitudes and their personalities that would be recognizable. And certainly they don't know there's 3 generations between each of these groups of people. And I do set it up that there are shreds of family lore which they know and which crop up. And I think that's, that happens in families. If certainly in military families, if an ancestor has served, that's often a spur to serve yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, David, and best of luck in this brand new venture. And thanks to all of you out there for listening. A final big thank you to Politics and Prose, one of the best bookstores in the business. Be sure to buy all your books there. Over to you, Brad.
Well, Marie, great moderating, and you're welcome to come try to sell books at PNP anytime you want, because you do it so well. And David, it's so fascinating to hear about how you took some family stories, not all as they turned out actually true, but you were able to establish enough facts to then spin them into a sweeping fictional saga. Before we go, I do want to ask about that seafaring backdrop we've all been looking at for the past hour. Do you want to say something about those ships?
There is, in the closing stages, the family gets engaged in a privateering venture. And Waldoboro was a shipbuilding center. I believe in the 1840s, it was the 5th largest shipbuilding city in the country. I think it trailed all the others by a lot. but and that was because the forests were there and they were building wooden ships, and it was very convenient. But on the Maine coast, you're never far from the ocean.
It's a very enticing scene there behind you. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of The New Land. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.